Not on my itinerary, not in anybody's itinerary, but this is the birthplace of former President Grover Cleveland, and I'm gonna have to do a little historical research on him. I know he was in the late 1800s, and I also remember that he was a very large man. And he might have served more than one term. Two, like with another president in between his two terms, as I recall. Anyway, it's a nice church next to it. Where am I? In Caldwell, New Jersey, thereabouts. So, well, he's had a nice backyard, and he had apples to pick from the orchard in the backyard. Those apple trees were around then. So it says it's closed. I guess you can take tours sometime. But this is where one of our presidents got his start. And I'll see if I can flesh out more about Grover Cleveland to come up with a whole YouTube video that might be of interest to someone. Not that he had this back in the day, but there's a Dunkin' Donuts right across the street, so that would have been helpful. So let's just see if there's any signage or anything. No pamphlets, but this is it. So to do my research, I went on Wikipedia, looked up Grover Cleveland's birthplace, and then read a lot about Grover Cleveland himself. And yep, this is the guy I was thinking of from the late 1800s. And as a president, he did serve 2 non-consecutive terms, 1885 to 89, and then 1893 to 1897. And then I came across this book, which I probably got out of reading Wikipedia, and it talks about a whole side of Grover Cleveland that most people never knew about, and brought it back to light. And I thought it was a very interesting read, and I never really thought one way or the other about Grover Cleveland, but after reading this, I was really not happy to hear that a guy like this was the president of our country. This is what Grover Cleveland looked like before he started putting on a lot of weight. Here he is when he's 27 years old. He's already a practicing attorney, and he might have been an assistant district attorney and then a district attorney during this time, or maybe a little bit later, but he was a hard worker, I'll give him that. And but he had some strange things in his personal life. So this is when he's 27 years old, and it's also the age difference between him and his future wife. So this is the same year that she was born, in 1864. And then one thing, he practiced and lived in Buffalo, New York, and this is one of the rooming houses that he lived in. He didn't have his own place. He was earning a lot of money, but he was just living in like rooming houses and hotels, not first class hotels, but second tier. And so at the rooming houses, the meals were all prepared for him. And then when he lived in the hotels, he would always go out to eat. So he wasn't really someone to, make his own meals and really do much in the way of setting up his own residence until he got into his mid to late 30s. Then he finally got an apartment. But this particular house is kind of a busy picture, but he lived in this house. It was a former mansion owned by William Fargo, who founded Wells Fargo and also was the head of American Express. And then William Fargo built another even much grander estate in Buffalo. But this was one of his houses after he lived in the house, and they turned it into a rooming house. So, and this is Grover Cleveland in his early mid-30s with all of his siblings except for one sister who was a missionary in what is now Sri Lanka. So she was all the way on the other side of the world, and she kept in touch, but she wasn't able to be there for funerals and weddings and stuff like that. But so here he is with his other siblings. He came from a big family, 9 kids. He was in the middle. And his 2 older brothers are pictured here in the front row. And they both served in the Civil War, unlike Grover Cleveland. And then they went into business together. The one brother owned a hotel in Fairfield, Connecticut, and then he bought the lease for another hotel in the Bahamas. And he and the other brother in the front row were sailing down to the Bahamas to start operating this hotel down there, but their ship caught fire, sank, and they both were lost at sea. So, but they both look like fine, upstanding gentlemen, Civil War heroes. They both rose up the ranks, and at the end of the war, they were lieutenants in the Union Army. So, but they seem like they would have been the ones you would probably more want to have be your president, and instead of Grover, who's already starting to develop a paunch sitting there on the left. So at the same time that Grover was about the age that you saw him there in that picture, he met this woman, Maria Halpin, in Buffalo, and he met her before, but then he ran into her on the street and convinced her to not go to a party that she was expected at, but to go out to dinner with him. He was really insistent. And then she's about the same age, maybe a little younger, a widow, and she had 2 kids, one of whom was living with the child's grandparents and one who was living with her. And after dinner, after wining and dining her, he took her back to her rooming house where she lived, which was fairly near him, and escorted her to her room. And her son, who's 10 years old, is in the other room, and he raped her and caused her to conceive a child. And that's a whole story in and of itself. But this was while he was the sheriff of Erie County, where Buffalo, New York is. And so she had no one to go to. She could, back then in the 1870s, 1880s, even if you had a legitimate case, it was tough to prove. The woman was thought to be guilty for allowing such a thing to happen to her, rather than the man being guilty for committing the act. But so he basically ruined her life. She conceived the child, brought the child to term, and gave birth to the child. And then, to add insult to injury, he had the child taken away from her and given to other people. And on top of all that, he had her committed to an insane asylum because she was saying, that he should do the honorable thing and marry her for making her pregnant. And he said no, he wouldn't do that. He'd give her money, and she wasn't happy. But why he felt like she couldn't have the child too, maybe because he felt like that would be scandalous. So he committed her to the local insane asylum. They evaluated her and found out that she wasn't insane and released her in 2 to 3 days. So really a whole sordid chain of events. And so this is a guy who had that in his background, and it later became a factor in the political campaign. But people who were for him whitewashed things and claimed that the other side were just doing things for political purposes or whatever. But so a lot of the book that I read has a lot to do with her and from her side of the story. And so it's very interesting from that perspective. So even with all that baggage, personal baggage, he became mayor of Buffalo and cleaned up a little corruption there, and then promptly became governor of New York for 2 years. And then right after that became president of the United States. And when he came into office, he kept getting larger and larger. So here he's always the biggest one in all these pictures, but here he is seated with his first cabinet. And back in the day, no women, no minorities, all white guys. And I'm sure, they meant well and everything, but there was just no thought of diversity back then in the 1800s. And the Democrats back then were not too crazy about giving remunerations to African Americans who had suffered through slavery. So they were not for Reconstruction in the South. So he got elected, and then after he got elected, he was a bachelor. He was one of the few presidents to be bachelors when they entered the White House. And he was the only president to get married in the White House. And this was his young bride, who was only 21 years old, Frances Folsom, who was the daughter of his best friend, who they were both lawyers, and his best friend, last name Folsom, he died in a horse carriage accident. And so Grover Cleveland watched over this young girl's affairs, working with her mother, and he was sort of the financial conservator for her money. And so he started doing that at age when she was 11 years old. But so even when she was first born, he brought her a baby carriage, and that was the present he gave to the parents. So he knew her from birth, and it was literally robbing the cradle when they got married. So she went to college in upstate New York, Wells College, graduated from there. He was sort of courting her while he's in the White House, and she's in college. He's sending her big bouquets of flowers every week and everything, and he's kind of her secret suitor. I don't think she really revealed who her boyfriend was, who happened to be the president of the United States. And then after she graduated, she and her mother and another relative went on a grand tour of Europe. And then when they came back from Europe, they came back to New York, and they stayed at this hotel, and nothing doing. He wanted to get married right away. So this is where she stayed the night before she took the train down to Washington, D.C. on a Wednesday to get married that night in the White House on a Wednesday night, unusual time for a wedding. But more on that later. Let's go now to where this hotel is today. It still exists today.
This was the former Gilsey House Hotel that Frances Folsom stayed in with her mother before she went down to Washington, D.C. on the train and got married to Grover Cleveland on the same day on a Wednesday. in the White House. The first ever wedding of an American president in the White House. And she was only 21 years old. And she had just come back from a extended trip in Europe with her mother after graduating from college. So it's all behind scaffolding right now, but it's still an impressive building. It's an apartment building now. And we're at 29th and Broadway, the southern end of the fashion district of Manhattan. There's some other vintage buildings from that era along Broadway. It's actually a pretty impressive set of buildings here just south of Midtown along Broadway. We'll take another look back at the Gilsey House apartment building, and we are in the Madison Square North Historic District here at 29th and Broadway, and looking up the street, that's Times Square to the north.
So Frances Folsom came down to the White House and to get married. She had been at the White House previously once or twice when Grover Cleveland gave her and her mother the guided tour, and everybody thought that if Grover was going to marry anybody, he was going to marry Frances's mother, who was the widow of his best friend, but he had his eyes set on the daughter instead. So anyway, when she came down and they got married in the White House, White House had a lot of greenhouses back then where the executive office building is today. This is a view sort of looking from behind the White House, the back side on the left side, or the right side as you face the White House from Pennsylvania Avenue. So when Grover Cleveland got married, he didn't want any press there. He wasn't a big fan of the media, maybe because he felt like he'd been chased by them a lot during his scandalous presidential campaign, and for whatever reason, he just didn't like the press. So he had a limited number of guests, and there are no pictures that I could find on the internet of the actual wedding. Now, the camera existed back then. You've seen some pictures from earlier, before the wedding took place in the late 1880s. But so this is like the only sketch, and it's almost done by someone who's picturing it as it might have looked, as either described to the person who painted the painting, or someone who was actually there. But they had a limited number of guests, mostly just cabinet members and their wives, and it was held in the Blue Room of the White House, which is one of the smallest rooms. And that was it. They had a honeymoon, I think, in West Virginia at a resort, and then they came back. And so Frances Folsom was only 21 when she got married, and the public loved, they didn't, maybe they were kind of raising their eyebrows over the age difference, but they loved the fact that the First Lady was so young. And this is a picture of both of them a year after their marriage. So back in the day, you could take pictures of people and put it on your product to help sell your bottle of dishwashing liquid or your box of cereal, whatever, and the person whose picture was being used didn't have the right to say they should be paid for their likeness on the box or the bottle. But that was done a lot with Frances Folsom. She was like the American sweetheart. So, and a lot of photographs of her taken of her very young. And so then, and Cleveland had a fairly successful first term. Public thought well of him, and his vice president that he had started off with, his vice president had died, so he had picked another man, A.G. Thurman, to be his vice presidential running mate to run for re-election. But even with a very popular first lady and a fairly successful first term, he didn't win re-election. And so there might have been some political shenanigans that went on, but the Republican candidate came in after him, and he was out of work, and they had to leave the White House. But Frances Folsom told the staff to not change anything because they would be back. So she was, still in her early 20s, and she was retiring as First Lady. But so what they do? Well, they couldn't go back to Buffalo because Grover Cleveland felt like a lot of people didn't think highly of him based on what happened with Maria Halpin. A lot of people believe Maria Halpin's side of the story. And I don't think they even voted for him in either one or both of the elections. He wasn't particularly well liked back in Buffalo, so he felt like he couldn't go back to Buffalo. So what did he do? He went to New York City instead. And the first place he went to was the Hotel Victoria, and stayed there. It was on 27th Street. It's no longer existing. And then he needed a place to live, regular place, not just a hotel. And so he rented a house from a wealthy businessman, Mr. Marquand, who owned a mansion on the corner of 68th and Madison. And this is a picture of the overall mansion. And then there's two townhouses to the back of the mansion on the Madison Avenue side. And one was rented to Mr. Marquand, one of his daughters, and the other one he rented to Grover Cleveland. And so this mansion and the two adjoining townhouses are no longer there. They were replaced by an apartment building that's now called the Marquand, and it's a very Tony area of town, and we'll go there now.
Okay, this is where Grover and Frances Cleveland lived between his two terms in office from like 1889 to 1893. But the townhouse building is no longer here. But the building next door looks a lot like what it probably looked like back then. We're on Upper Madison Avenue in Manhattan, and I don't think there were as many buses back then as there are now. It's a major bus traffic way. But so they live north of Midtown in what today is a very nice area, Upper Madison Avenue, very nice retail. So let's say that this is just like their house. So this is a 5-story house that I don't know whether they owned it or rented it. I think they lived two different places in Manhattan, and they also had a summer home that they spent a lot of time at, sort of just outside of Cape Cod, Buzzards Bay. But this is their block that they primarily lived at in that 4-year period between his two terms in office. So it still has some buildings from the late 1800s, as well as some more modern buildings. But these are the kinds of townhouses that were probably pretty new when they moved in here. Maybe they were built in the 1870s or early in the 1880s, so they moved in right at the end of that decade. So, just gives you a little flavor. And on to the next spot. So 816 Madison Avenue was their address when they lived here, and it's now part of the Marquand apartment building, and I think that was built in the early 1900s, 1910, 1920, that era. So, and you can look around, you can see other high-end brownstone type buildings in this neighborhood. And just to get a little more flavor of this neighborhood, this is the block between 67th and 68th on Madison Avenue, all very high-end stores. And now it's as quiet as it was in the late 1800s. So maybe this is a good time to film it. Now, one thing Grover Cleveland liked to do in his free time was hang out with his wealthy friends. And he would hang out with one guy who owned a yacht. And he also went and spent a lot of time at his friend's house in Brooklyn, in Bedford-Stuyvesant. And this is what the house looked like in the 1890s and what it looks like today. And we're going to go there now and show you the neighborhood. This is 247 Hancock Street in Bed-Stuy, and it's a house that was built by a water meter reading magnate named John Kelly, and it's where Grover Cleveland liked to hang out with him, and maybe they shot billiards down in the basement. And this house recently sold for $6 million plus, so it's the most expensive house sale in Bedford-Stuyvesant. But just look at the block that it's on. It's a beautiful brownstone block, and beautiful houses across the street. And this is really in the heart of Bedford-Stuyvesant. And as far as I know, Cleveland only lived in Manhattan. So how he got out here back in the late 1800s, before there was a subway, I mean, there were trolley lines, horse-drawn lines, and steam-powered lines. So maybe he came out that way, or maybe he took a horse and buggy. So he had 4 years between his terms, and he didn't work that much, I'm told. He had an office at a law firm that I think he paid for to have the office. I don't know how much revenue he brought in, but he liked to hang out with wealthy friends, including one friend who had a yacht, and ultimately wound up living in Greenwich, Connecticut, very wealthy. But this is supposedly one of his hangouts that he came to in Brooklyn. Beautiful. I think it's 8,000 square feet. So it's one of the only single-family detached houses in the neighborhood. Everything else is attached, as you can see. Anyway, this just makes me want to come back and do a fuller exploration of Bedford-Stuyvesant. What a beautiful neighborhood. Okay, on to the next stop. Now, while
Grover Cleveland was living in New York City, he was planning his comeback to run again for the White House. And while he was in New York, he had this picture taken with him and his running mate, Adlai Stevenson I. That name might be familiar to some people. Adlai Stevenson III was the UN ambassador under Kennedy in the 1960s. So they had this picture taken in Union Square in Manhattan, and what a exciting team they looked like. And I don't know if this plate did them any further justice, but this was one of the ways that they campaigned back then, had their images on plates. But I'm not sure what they did in the way of active campaigning. A lot of the campaigning back in the day was done from people's front porches. I don't know which front porch Grover Cleveland was standing on, if he had a front porch, but the campaigning of the day was very low key. But he did win re-election, and so went back to the White House, and he went back to working hard. He was always known as a hard-working guy who would even the telephone was invented during this time, and on weekends, I mean, there might have been one phone in the entire White House, but when the other people were taking the weekend off and he'd be working, if the phone rang, the President of the United States would answer the phone. So it was a different day. But he had another new cabinet, again, a bunch of older white guys. They all looked to be different from the first set that he had the first go around. And he seems even larger in comparison to everyone else on the cabinet. But he was back in office, but this time there was a financial panic going on, and Grover Cleveland kind of took a laissez-faire attitude, kind of like the Calvin Coolidge of the 1800s, and he didn't really feel like the government could or should do anything to step in and help solve the financial problems. But and he believed in the business cycles, and the next cycle would be an upturn, which actually was the case under the president who succeeded him, William McKinley. So he was back in the White House, and again, his wife was very popular and still very young, still in her 20s, and they liked to show a picture of her, showcasing her as opposed to him. So she was stealing the show, and this is an attractive portrait of her that was done after Grover Cleveland's second term in office. At the end of his second term, his popularity had sunk so much that his party did not want to nominate him again for another term, and but he took that okay, and the person that they chose to run instead lost to William McKinley, so it kind of backfired on the Democrats. But this is his wife in 1899 when she was 35 years old, and she'd had 4 children by now. But when she no longer was the first lady in 1895, she was only 31 years old, and you can compare that to, or she was 33 years old, and you can compare that to Jackie Kennedy, who became a first lady when she was 31. And so they were really both the same age when both their husbands were, their terms ended. Unfortunately for Jackie Kennedy, it was because her husband was assassinated, JFK. So Grover Cleveland and Frances Cleveland's firstborn daughter was named Ruth, and they called her Baby Ruth. And she was born in New York City between the his two terms in office in the White House. And this is her in 1897 at age 6. Unfortunately, she died when she was only 12 years old of diphtheria in Princeton, New Jersey, where the Clevelands moved after they moved out of the White House. That's where they spent the rest of his time in Princeton. And so there's two theories as to the famous Baby Ruth candy bar. One is that it was really named after Babe Ruth, but since Babe Ruth was still living, and they felt like they'd have to pay him for his name, they said, "Oh, it's not named after you; it's named after Baby Ruth Cleveland." So this is the little girl who fortunately did not live to adulthood. And so this is Grover Cleveland and Frances a year before he died. And in this picture, he's 70 years old. His wife is just 43. And these are their 4 other children. And so you can see the little boy who's, I think he's only 4 years old at the time. And his dad is 70 because Grover Cleveland was 66 when he was born. So the little boy didn't get to see much of his dad because his dad passed away the following year when the little boy was 5 and Grover was 71. But it's the age of most grandparents, but he was the father of these young children. And in 1908, this is his hearse being brought to the Princeton Cemetery.
Okay, so the book that I got from Amazon is called A Secret Life, The Lies and Scandals of President Grover Cleveland by Charles Lockman. And it's a good book. It's a quick read. It's like 500 pages long. And this is where I get a lot of my facts. So Grover Cleveland was the oldest president to be married for the first time. He was 49 years old. When he first entered office, his first term in office, he was a bachelor, still a bachelor. And he then got married during his first term in office, and is the only American president to actually be married in the White House. They had a small ceremony in the Blue Room of the White House. What's also interesting is that his wife was only 21 years old, so there was a 27-year age difference. That's the biggest age difference of any American president for their first marriage. There was one other president, I believe it was Tyler, who after his first wife passed away, he remarried, and his second wife was 30 years younger than him. He was average height. He was 5'11", my height, but he was the second heaviest of all American presidents. A lot of places list him as 260 pounds, but he also got up to reportedly 300 pounds. So only William Howard Taft was heavier at 350 pounds. So that couldn't have been that inspiring for people who were looking up to the president in terms of how you should be physically. He is considered to be in the middle third of all the presidents, the middle 20%, middle fifth, and he's kind of in a rogues gallery of other presidents in that category. Other presidents that are in the middle 20% are Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford, Calvin Coolidge, William Taft, and George Bush Sr. And of all the presidents in this category, there's a couple others. William McKinley was one. Taft was the only one who served 8 full years. So he had 8 years to make an impression and get up into that upper tier, but he's definitely thought of as being in the middle. When he was born in 1837, he was of the age where you could have served in the Civil War, but back in those days, you could pay someone else. If you were drafted, you could pay someone else to serve in place of you, and he chose that route rather than to fight in the war. I think a couple of his brothers fought in the war, but he took the way out of, he hired a Polish immigrant and paid him $150, which would be the equivalent of around $3,000 today. And so that man fought in his place, survived the war, supposedly wasn't very well off after the war, I mean, economics wise, but I don't think Grover Cleveland did anything special to help him out. So, as I mentioned before, he was the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms for a total of 8 years. He could have run again. There was no law prohibiting him from serving more than 8 years. He chose not to run after the second term in office. He was thought of as being unpopular at that point, and he probably felt he couldn't win. So, but he had a meteoric rise in politics. He was working as a private attorney, and he was asked to be sheriff of Erie County, where Buffalo, New York is. And he did that for a short stint, made a lot of money doing that. He made the equivalent of like $300,000, $400,000 a year, which is pretty high pay for that kind of position. And then he went back to private practice. But then he was drafted to be mayor of Buffalo. So he served 2 years as mayor, and he didn't believe in the patronage system, so he was trying to eliminate graft. So people felt that was great, what he was trying to do. He was trying to turn things around. So after only 2 years, he was asked to run for governor, ran for governor of New York, and became governor, his first attempt. And he was governor for only 2 years. Back then the terms were only 2 years, but he vetoed a lot of spending bills, and people felt like, here's a guy who's very financially conservative. This is the kind of guy we need in the White House, and they got him to run as a Democrat for president, and he won. So he went from not being in elective office to going from mayor, governor to president, all in the span of 4 years. So that's pretty meteoric. He had a vice president, his first term in office, named Thomas Hendricks from Indiana. And Thomas Hendricks died 8 months into their term, and he didn't replace him. He just served the rest of the first presidential term without a vice president. A lot of people think Cleveland, Grover Cleveland, Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland, Ohio was not named after Grover Cleveland. It was around before him, but it was named after one of his distant relatives, General Moses Cleveland. One of the other things about him is he did not like Abe Lincoln. I mean, how could you not like Abe Lincoln? But he didn't. So one of the worst things about Grover Cleveland is that he was alleged to have raped a woman in Buffalo while he was sheriff of Erie County. He was in his 40s, and the woman, who was a widow and had a couple of kids from her deceased husband, felt that Grover Cleveland should marry her, even though she wasn't happy about him forcing himself on her, and he would not do that. And she was insistent that he clear her good name. It was very scandalous back then. It's scandalous today, but she really felt like, when you were the victim, you were really shamed by society. It wasn't just the man usually was not held in low esteem, but the woman was, for having been raped. So he wanted to get rid of her. He had her committed to an insane asylum in Buffalo. She was admitted against her will. They evaluated her, determined she wasn't insane, and they released her like within 3 days. So she gave birth to a son who was then taken from her and given to other people that Grover Cleveland knew to raise, and she was not allowed to keep the boy. So you can imagine the mental anguish that she went through. But he left that in the past, and then he ran for president, but it did come up as an issue. But there were people who said, oh, she's lying and everything, and that she was really made to be like a scapegoat, and this was just a political thing. But if you read the book and you really step back and evaluate it, what happened is probably what she said happened. So shame on Grover Cleveland. When he did get married in the White House to this young 21-year-old woman, he knew this woman from birth because she was the daughter of his best friend, and his best friend was also a lawyer, and he was killed in a carriage accident, and Grover Cleveland stepped in. He acted as the financial conservator for her, working with her mother, and he took care of all the financial affairs. But since the girl knew Grover Cleveland since she was a little girl, she referred to him as Uncle Grover. So she married Uncle Grover, which is kind of strange, even for back then. So when they did get married, she had just come back from a European trip after graduating from college, and they nothing to do, and they had to get married quickly. So she came back to New York, stayed in a hotel there, took the train down with her mother down to Washington, D.C., and they got married on a Wednesday night in the White House. And there were no pictures. The camera was invented, and there were pictures dating to way before the late 1800s. This was 1886. But the only thing you can come across is sort of a poorly drawn sketch of what it might have looked like. But Grover Cleveland didn't want any media there, no press, and it was a very small group of people that were witnesses to the wedding. After he died in the early 1900s, she waited several years, and then she remarried, and she'd been married to Grover Cleveland for 22 years. Her second husband, who she married in her 40s, they were married for 34 years, and I believe she passed away. Her second husband was closer in age. I think he was only 2 years older, and she passed away first, and he had it arranged so that she'd be buried next to her first husband, Grover Cleveland. Her second husband's name was Thomas Preston, and one of his peculiarities was he liked to crochet with her. The two of them would crochet together, so that's different. One thing that's also interesting is that they both were against women having the right to vote, and she actually was part of a campaign against women's right to vote. And women didn't get the right to vote until 1920. So in the early 1900s, and even before that, the subject was brought up. But here's what they each had to say about women's suffrage, or the women's right to vote. Frances Cleveland, Grover Cleveland's wife, said, women, quote, women weren't yet intelligent enough to vote. And Grover, his quote was, sensible and responsible women do not want to vote. The relative positions to be assumed by men and women in the working out of our civilization were assigned long ago by a higher intelligence. So they weren't really progressive in that standpoint. So they had 5 children. Grover Cleveland's still becoming a new father in his 60s. They had 5 children. His youngest child was born when Frances, the mother, was 39 and he was 66. So he's still going strong in his 60s. Their first child, they had 3 girls and then 2 boys. The first child, Ruth, sort of has a famous name. They called her Baby Ruth, and there's a candy bar that still exists today in the US called Baby Ruth. But there's some argument over whether it was really taking Babe Ruth's name and changing it a little bit without his authorization, or capitalizing on the little girl's popularity. But unfortunately, the little girl died when she was only 11 or 12. She died of diphtheria, and one of their other girls also had diphtheria, but survived. So one of the other things about Grover Cleveland is died of heart disease, but before that he had cancer. He smoked cigars and he chewed tobacco. So guess what? He got cancer of the mouth and jaw, and he wanted to keep it secret. It was during his second term in office, and they were having a financial panic at the time, the greatest financial panic before the Great Depression, and he didn't want to worry the public and the stock markets, so he secretly had surgery done to remove this tumor in the upper part of his mouth aboard a yacht that one of his wealthy friends owned, and they sailed out in New York Harbor, and it was performed in the yacht so that no press could find out. And what the press office for Grover Cleveland, the information they gave out was that he was on vacation and he was sailing, and then but he had to spend some time convalescing afterwards. But it basically kept them out of the public eye for 2-3 months, and they fitted him with a prosthetic piece of rubber in his mouth, and it did not affect his speech, so it hid that from everyone. And it was only revealed later on that he had this while he was president. So those are just some of the facts about Grover Cleveland. He had one baby that was born in the White House, but his first baby, baby Ruth, she was born between terms. So when the Clevelands first got married, they didn't have any kids right away. And then they had 5 children. And then he's credited with having the 6th child by Maria Halpin, the woman he raped in his 40s, whose child, later on, they determined his true identity. He became a well-known obstetrician in Buffalo. So he did well, but he got off to a really rough start. So those are just some of the facts I just wanted to share with you back here at the birthplace of Grover Cleveland. I didn't want to read these facts to you at his gravesite. I didn't think that'd be appropriate, but I will include a picture of his tombstone in this video.
This brings us to the final segment. The burial sites of both Grover Cleveland and Maria Halpin. Now, Grover Cleveland is buried kind of inauspiciously in a cemetery in Princeton, New Jersey, near the Princeton University campus. And his headstone looks like it could use a cleaning. It's not that big. It does not indicate that he was president of the United States for 2 terms, for a total of 8 years. His wife is buried to his right. His daughter, baby Ruth, is buried to his left. It just, from what I've heard, the burial, the grave site of the next American president, William McKinley, who was assassinated in his late 50s, has a huge monument to him in Ohio, and other presidents have very much more auspicious grave sites than Grover Cleveland. Now, Grover Cleveland, he was a simple man, but he was worth a lot of money. He was actually one of the wealthier American presidents. He amassed what today would be around $30 million, and a lot of that was during public service. So it kind of is a question of how he achieved such wealth. But he did, but it wasn't used to pay for an expensive gravesite by any means. But if you choose to go, it's in Princeton, New Jersey, as I mentioned, and there's some other famous people buried in that cemetery, including the founder of Tulane University, for example. So, but I think if you do go, I think you owe it to yourself to also go to Maria Halpin's gravesite in New Rochelle, New York. She's the unfortunate collateral damage of Grover Cleveland, she and her family. She remarried. She actually remarried twice. She outlived her second husband, and then her third husband outlived her, so she was buried in New Rochelle, near where they lived. And you can get to that various ways, either mass transit or driving. It's just north of New York City. So I just feel like, after watching all this video and doing the research, I learned a lot about this woman, and I don't think she should be forgotten about. And just because she wasn't president of the United States, she still was a valiant woman and had to undergo a lot of pressure from the media, who hounded her and tried to discredit her. And she stuck to her story. And but like that, something like that takes its toll on you. And she lived till she was 60 or 66, depending on what her actual birth year was. But the point is that she did pass away before Grover Cleveland. She died in 1902. And the picture of the next picture is of her daughter, who she left with the grandparents in Jersey City, New Jersey. Now her daughter, Ada, only lived until she was age 17, and she's buried in Cypress Hills Cemetery in Brooklyn, near where Maria is originally from, in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, where her father lived. He was a retired police officer. And she had 2 other sons. She had Frederick Halpin, who was the oldest, and he actually lived into his 80s and was a successful career person working for the Lackawanna Railroad, and he's buried in Matamoros, Pennsylvania. And then her illegitimate son by Grover Cleveland, and later was renamed James E. King and became a gynecologist, and actually for the benefit of women, which is ironic given his father's and his stepmother, if you will, their opinion about women's rights to vote. But he served women in the field of gynecology, and he was born 10 years after Maria's daughter Ada, and but he did become a successful doctor. That's the good part of the story. He had a rough start, though, being taken from the mother. He was passed between a couple of different couples before he finally was raised by the Kings and renamed James King. One other interesting fact is that Grover Cleveland insisted that the baby be named after his best friend who died, and to also have his last name, not Maria Halpin's last name. So the baby was originally Oscar Folsom Cleveland. Now Cleveland also did something really low-handed. He said, well, the baby could have been Oscar Folsom's, even though Oscar Folsom was married, and since he had died, he couldn't defend himself. But the person he was maligning, in a way, turned out to be the father of his wife. So strange things Grover Cleveland took to his grave. But if you do decide to go to see Maria Halpin's grave, her last name is under the name Hunt. That was her third husband. Beechwood Cemetery is sort of between Pelham, New York, and New Rochelle. So it's still there and still a well-kept cemetery. So that concludes it. I'd just like to say in conclusion that, you know, you can have a chance happening and walk and drive by a historic house, and it could set up a whole chain of research for you to learn a lot about American history. I know I did, and I hope you learned something from this video. Thanks for watching.